In the quiet dawn of a world still young with myth, there lived a woman whose beauty was both luminous and unsettling. Not yet a monster, not yet a symbol, she walked as a mortal among mortals, yet there was something in her presence that made the air itself pause. It was said that when she entered a room, even the most ordinary spaces seemed to hold their breath, as if aware that they were witnessing something rare. A fleeting harmony of light and form, a fleeting perfection that would not endure. She was Medusa, not yet crowned with serpents, not yet a harbinger of petrification. She was known only for her striking appearance, the kind that drew the eyes of men and the envy of women. In her gaze there was warmth and radiance, but also an unspoken command. To look was to see was to feel. It is here, in these earliest moments, that the seeds of myth are quietly planted, like stones dropped into water, their ripples expanding far beyond comprehension. To understand Medusa, one must first understand the world in which she lived. The Greeks of this age spoke of gods who walked alongside men, their anger sudden and their favor precious. Temples were places where mortal and divine intersected, where ritual and prayer sought to appease forces both protective and punishing. Within these spaces, beauty was more than adornment. It was a language, a currency, and a power capable of attracting not only admiration but danger. The world was smaller then, yet infinitely more treacherous, for envy and desire were forces as real as wind or fire. Medusa's beauty was not merely skin-deep. Her presence stirred admiration that could not be ignored, envy that simmered in quiet corners, and a subtle influence that would later be framed as transgression. She moved through life with the fragile freedom of those who are both adored and resented, who are at once a blessing and a warning. It is a paradox that recurs through myth. The mortal who embodies perfection becomes, almost inevitably, a mirror reflecting the desires, fears, and insecurities of all who behold them. Even in her earliest years, Medusa's life was threaded with contradiction. She was human, capable of love and laughter, yet she inspired awe as if touched by the divine. Her beauty drew people toward her, yet it isolated her, setting her apart from ordinary lives. The intensity of her presence foreshadowed the transformation to come, as if the world itself conspired to shape her story into a cautionary tale. In every glance that lingered too long, in every whisper carried on the wind, the first outlines of legend were being traced. It is tempting in the modern mind to imagine Medusa as simply a figure of horror, yet in this earliest chapter, she was neither monster nor symbol. She was human. Her story begins not with wrath or vengeance, but with admiration and envy, with the subtle shifting currents of social interaction that have shaped countless myths. The extraordinary, after all, has always demanded explanation. When a mortal exceeds the ordinary, when they embody something that seems beyond comprehension, the imagination seeks to contain them, to transform awe into story, beauty into warning. There is a quiet tragedy in this beginning, a sense that fate is already gathering its threads around her life. For in every myth, there is a turning point, a moment when the ordinary intersects with the divine, when admiration turns to fear, when envy becomes punishment. In Medusa, this intersection is not yet visible, but it hums beneath the surface, like a low wind rustling through reeds. Subtle, persistent, inevitable. Consider the human dimension of her early life. To be so striking, so noticed, is to carry a weight few can imagine. Eyes follow, whispers spread, and even the most mundane actions acquire significance. A glance, a smile, a walk down a crowded street, all become acts of influence. And in societies governed by gods who wielded vengeance as easily as blessing, such influence could be as dangerous as it was admired. Medusa's mortal life was therefore a fragile balance, a dance along a razor's edge between reverence and ruin, between being celebrated and being condemned. It is here that we glimpse the roots of her eventual myth. Medusa's story was never simply about snakes or stone. It was about what human societies do with those they cannot fully comprehend. It was about the fear of female power, the terror of beauty unbound by convention, and the human need to convert awe into narrative, to transform admiration into warning. Her mortality made her relatable, yet her extraordinary presence made her inevitable fodder for legend. As we trace the contours of this early life, We also encounter the psychology of myth-making. Medusa was not born with her curse. She was born with a presence that demanded story. Communities, like rivers, carved channels through imagination, and over time, the currents of envy, awe, and divine interest would erode the boundaries between mortal and immortal. Each glance cast in her direction, each word spoken in her absence, contributed to the slow crystallization of legend. In this sense, Medusa is not merely a figure of horror. She is a mirror, reflecting the hopes, fears, and moral anxieties of the world around her. And yet, for all the myth that would follow, there remains the human core. A young woman admired and envied, living a life that was ordinary in its simplicity and extraordinary in its effect. She was capable of friendship, of sorrow, of love. She could not yet foresee the wrath of gods, nor the transformation that would render her a warning for all who came after. The tension between human vulnerability and legendary consequence is palpable even now, thousands of years later, as we peer back into a time when story and reality were not so easily separated. In the stillness of this earliest chapter, there is a sense of inevitability that is both haunting and beautiful. Medusa's gaze, though not yet petrifying, was already formative. Her life, though still mortal, was already mythic. The currents of envy, admiration, and divine observation had begun to converge, setting the stage for the transformation that would render her eternal, not as a person, but as a story, a symbol, a caution. It is here, in this fragile dawn of her life, that we begin to understand why her myth endures. Medusa was more than beauty or horror. She was a reminder that the extraordinary always demands attention, that mortality and admiration are entwined with fear, and that the simplest human qualities, charm, grace, presence, can ripple through time and legend long after the individual has vanished. And so, before the snakes, before the curse, before the petrifying gaze that would terrify generations, there was a woman who simply existed. A mortal of rare presence, whose beauty and subtle power stirred the world around her. In her story, we see the quiet beginnings of myth, a reflection of human emotion, of social tension, of the awe and envy that have always shadowed those who shine too brightly. Even now, across the centuries, one can sense her in the air. A subtle pause in perception, a tremor of recognition that something extraordinary once walked the earth. Medusa, in her earliest form, was not a monster, but a mirror, reflecting both the beauty and the fear that resides in all who look upon the extraordinary. And in that reflection, we glimpse not just the story of a woman, but the birth of legend itself. In the dim glow of an olive-scented dawn, the marble columns of Athena's sanctuaries rose like frozen sentinels, their surfaces glinting faintly as the first light brushed against the carved reliefs of gods and mortals. Shadows pooled in the corridors, long and silent, as if the air itself held its breath. Here, within these sacred walls, the boundary between the divine and the mortal was thin, fragile as the wings of a moth brushing against a candle flame. Every footfall echoed like a heartbeat, every whisper seemed to linger longer than it should. It was in these halls, hallowed and austere, that the story of Medusa began to twist into a shape both tragic and eternal. Medusa was once a mortal, and like all mortals, she moved among temples with reverence and awe. Her beauty was quiet, almost unsettling, a perfection that seemed to disturb the natural order without effort. Eyes turned, tongues whispered. In the sanctuaries of Athena, she performed the rites expected of a devotee, the offerings placed carefully upon altars, her hands trembling beneath the weight of incense smoke and ritual oil. And yet, even in this sacred devotion, the mortal heart is vulnerable. Desire, envy, and the frailty of innocence cannot be contained, not even by the white stone of divinity. It was in such a place of worship, a space meant to shield and elevate, that violation entered the story. The act was sudden, and yet it seemed preordained, as though fate had been hovering among the shadows of the columns, waiting for this precise collision of human frailty and divine law. Medusa, caught in a moment of exposure, became both victim and instrument, a symbol through which the world would later speak of punishment and terror. The sanctity of Athena's temple, designed to inspire awe and reflection, now bore witness to a transgression that would ripple through myth for millennia. In examining this moment, one must pause to consider the interplay of power and piety that defined the Greek understanding of the world. The gods were not distant arbiters but active participants in human affairs, their eyes ever upon mortals' deeds. To be seen by divinity was to be vulnerable, for the gaze of a god was more than observation. It was judgment, a force capable of shaping destinies with the same certainty as the turning of the seasons. Medusa's innocence, once a source of quiet admiration, became a precarious burden under such scrutiny. The transgression within the temple was not merely physical. It was a breach of a cosmic order, a collision of vulnerability and divine expectation. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, witnessed the aftermath of this act. In the cold, unyielding logic of myth, she punished Medusa, not for the violation suffered, but for the desecration of her sacred space. In this transformation, beauty became horror, and the mortal woman was turned into a creature whose gaze would petrify. It is tempting to read this as cruelty, yet within the language of myth there is also a warning, a codification of societal anxieties about power, purity, and transgression. The gods were mirrors of human consciousness, their laws reflecting the fears and moral structures of the societies that revered them. Medusa's curse is both a divine decree and a story of human fragility, a reminder that innocence and beauty could, in the wrong circumstances, become liabilities. This moment, frozen in myth and memory, speaks also to the way humans have long interpreted the sacred. Temples were not merely places of ritual. They were arenas in which the human mind confronted the limits of understanding. The fear that Medusa inspired, of gaze, of beauty, of transgression, was in part a meditation on the precariousness of life under the eyes of forces larger than oneself. To be mortal is to walk a narrow path between devotion and disaster, between reverence and inadvertent sacrilege. Every act, every thought, could be magnified under the scrutiny of gods, their judgment as inevitable as sunrise. Medusa's story captures the tension between human desire and divine expectation, and in this tension, we glimpse the origin of her terror. The transformation of Medusa within the temple is also a reflection of the ancient understanding of law, justice, and blame. In societies where the gods embodied moral authority, punishment often bypassed the perpetrator, striking instead those who were already vulnerable. Medusa's fate, her exile, her monstrous visage, her petrifying gaze, was a narrative shaped as much by human notions of shame and accountability as by divine intervention. Myths, in this way, served as both moral compass and psychological canvas, mapping the fears and anxieties of those who told them. The violation in the temple became more than a story of an individual. It became a reflection of how societies process trauma, injustice, and the fragile line between victim and transgressor. Even the architecture of the temple itself seems to whisper its complicity. The narrow corridors, the echoing chambers, the cold stone surfaces that gleamed with ritual oil, all of it conspired to magnify the significance of that single moment. Space and story intertwined, each supporting the other in a silent choreography of fear and awe. The temple was no longer merely a house of worship. It was a stage on which the narrative of Medusa was enacted, a place where the sacred and the profane collided in the form of one mortal woman's fate. The columns, carved with images of gods, heroes, and monsters, bore silent witness to a drama that would echo across centuries, shaping art, literature, and the human imagination itself. In reflecting upon this chapter of Medusa's life, one begins to understand the profound resonance of her story. It is not simply a tale of punishment or monstrosity. It is a meditation on the human condition, the ways in which innocence can be weaponized, beauty can become a liability, and transgression, whether real or perceived, can alter destiny irrevocably. Medusa's transformation is a mirror held to the fears and moral codes of an ancient civilization, a civilization in which the gaze of the divine dictated the boundaries of action, and where human vulnerability was endlessly scrutinized, interpreted, and at times condemned. As the sun rises over the distant cliffs where she would later be exiled, one can almost hear the echo of her story carried in the wind, the whisper of marble columns, the faint hiss of time against stone. Medusa's life within the temple, brief yet monumental, became the seed from which the Gorgon myth would grow. It is a story that asks of us to consider how societies encode fear and justice, how the sacred can be both protective and punishing, and how the lives of individuals are shaped by forces they cannot control. In every retelling, there is a reminder of the fragile dance between mortality and divinity, between innocence and transgression, between the seen and the watcher. And so, within the shadowed halls of Athena's sanctuaries, beneath the weight of history and myth, Medusa's story begins to take form, not merely as a tale of horror, but as a meditation on power, justice, and human vulnerability. She is at once victim and symbol, mortal and monster, punished and remembered. In the stillness of the temple, where light glints off cold marble and incense lingers long after prayers have faded, we hear the echo of a warning that is older than words, older than memory, older even than the gods themselves. A warning that innocence, however pure, can awaken forces beyond comprehension, and that the gaze of the divine. In the silent sanctuaries of ancient Greece, where sunlight pooled like liquid gold across marble floors and the air carried the faint scent of olive oil and incense, a single act of mortal misfortune would be transfigured into eternity. It was here, amidst the shadows of Athena's temples, that Medusa, once a maiden of rare beauty, stood at the fragile intersection of innocence and divine scrutiny. She was mortal, yet her fate was ensnared in the weave of gods, a reminder that in this world of myth, the gaze of the divine could shape life as inexorably as the turning of the seasons. The story that has come down to us is deceptively simple, told in hushed tones by poets and dramatists. Medusa, a priestess of Athena, was violated within the sacred precincts of the goddess's temple. Yet beneath the surface of these words lies a tapestry of power, fear, and cosmic justice as the Greeks understood it. Temples were not mere buildings of stone. They were liminal spaces, thresholds where the mortal dared to brush against the infinite. And in such spaces an offense, whether real, perceived, or metaphorical, was not a private matter but a rupture in the order of the cosmos. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and war, embodies the delicate balance of intellect and inevitability. Her eyes are said to see the threads of cause and consequence, and when Medusa's fate was sealed, it was not with the caprice of mere anger but with the weight of cosmic symbolism. The maiden's transformation, her hair into serpents, her gaze capable of petrifying life, was punishment and protection intertwined. Scholars have long debated the meaning of this act. Was it retribution, a warning, or a reshaping of power itself? Some suggest that Medusa's metamorphosis mirrors the Greek understanding of justice as inseparable from inevitability. A single violation in the sacred realm ripples outward, demanding correction in form and in consequence. But there is something more human beneath the myth. Medusa's story is, in its deepest sense, the story of vulnerability under scrutiny. Ancient texts and artistic representations portray her as both monstrous and pitiable, an eternal figure of fear, yet one whose punishment carries the echo of innocence wronged. To step inside Athena's temple was to step into a crucible, where the god's perception could crystallize an act of violence into a lifelong or immortal mark. The transformation into a gorgon, then, is not only a physical metamorphosis but a psychological one. It is the embodiment of trauma, immortalized in serpentine form, a living memorial to both fear and divine authority. In examining Medusa's change, we see reflected the Greeks' intricate relationship with power, gender, and sanctity. Athena, herself a virgin goddess, is an archetype of control and order, yet her punishment of Medusa blurs the lines between justice and cruelty. It is as if the myth itself is aware of its own moral ambiguity. Medusa, violated yet punished, becomes an agent of fear. She is both victim and weapon, embodying a world in which innocence can be mistaken for provocation, and the act of survival becomes indistinguishable from transgression. This duality is central to her enduring fascination. She is a warning, a mirror, and an enigma all at once. Visualize her in the lonely wilderness beyond the sanctum, once radiant hair coiled now into hissing serpents, eyes that mirror the terror of those who approach. Every gaze cast upon her becomes a test of courage and mortality. Every whispered recounting of her story carries the weight of a society negotiating the boundaries between the mortal and the divine, the human and the monstrous. The Greeks, in embedding such lessons in their myths, were not merely crafting tales of fear. They were encoding the fragility of life, the consequences of transgression, and the stark impartiality of the gods. Yet, the Gorgon is not solely a figure of wrath. She is a testament to endurance. Medusa's isolation, forced by divine decree, turns her into a liminal guardian of thresholds, a sentinel whose presence commands respect and fear. Her serpentine visage transforms vulnerability into power, a symbolic reclaiming of agency even within the confines of punishment. In the imagery of later art, Medusa's head becomes apotropaic, a protective emblem against harm, an inversion of the violence done to her. The Greeks understood that terror itself could be harnessed, that the visage of a punished woman could serve both as admonition and shield. The narrative also reveals a quiet, unsettling truth about the interplay of mortals and gods. Innocence, once touched by the divine, is never the same again. Medusa's transformation is both a lesson in the authority of the sacred and a meditation on human fragility. Her story is a meditation on the moral and psychological landscapes of antiquity, a civilization negotiating the limits of divine intervention, human desire, and the perilous thresholds of sanctity. Every serpent that curls upon her head, every petrifying gaze, speaks not only of fear but of the enduring consequences of events that cannot be undone. As the centuries unfolded, Medusa's tale would be interpreted, reinterpreted, and dissected through the lenses of art, literature, and scholarship. Yet at its core, it retains the eerie intimacy of a story whispered across time. A woman punished, a goddess asserting dominion, and a mortal world learning, in silence and terror, the weight of crossing sacred boundaries. It is a story that asks us to confront the uncomfortable alignment of innocence, violence, and divine order. A story that refuses to settle neatly into morality or history alone. And so Medusa stands, eternally transformed, a paradox of beauty and horror, a relic of human fear and divine judgment entwined. In the Gorgon's serpentine gaze, we see the reflection of a society negotiating the complex interplay of transgression and consequence, of justice and cruelty, of innocence violated yet fearsome in its endurance. The wrath of Athena, once immediate and terrifying, has become timeless, etched into the consciousness of civilizations, reminding us that in myth, as in life, the boundaries between victim and transgressor, punishment and power, are rarely clear. In the shadowed sanctuaries and the deserted wilderness, Medusa's story lingers, a whisper against the stones, a warning written in the language of serpents. She is no mere monster, no simple emblem of fear. She is a testament to the enduring resonance of human experience, a living mirror reflecting the frailty, terror, and resilience that define us all. And in that gaze, eternal and unyielding, we are forced to confront a truth that is as ancient as it is unsettling. The world of gods is a world of consequence, and in its mirror, even the most innocent may be forever changed. When the world of gods turned its gaze from Medusa, the mortal plane became both prison and refuge. She was cast out, exiled to the wild margins where earth meets the ungovernable sea, where the wind carves cliffs and salt gnaws at the stones. Here, beyond the reach of temples and the eyes of men, she would endure the slow unraveling of her old self, and the formation of something entirely new, something terrible, luminous, and eternal. Exile in ancient myth is never mere isolation. It is both punishment and transformation, a liminal space where the boundaries of identity are tested and reshaped. Medusa, uprooted from the sanctuaries of Athens, wandered into landscapes that were inhospitable to ordinary mortals. Jagged cliffs, wind-swept beaches, and hidden caves, where the cries of seabirds echoed like the lamentations of the forsaken. Yet in this desolation, there was a strange clarity. Removed from the prying eyes of the civilized world, she became the arbiter of her own existence, a presence at once mournful and formidable. The Greeks saw exile as more than mere distance. It was a symbolic geography. To be cast from the heart of society was to be placed at the thresholds of chaos and order, life and death, visibility and concealment. Medusa's new realm was a reflection of her transformed self, a place unbounded by the laws of men, yet entirely under the influence of forces beyond human comprehension. The wind that tore at her serpents was not simply air, but a carrier of time, memory, and fate. The stones beneath her feet were not inert, but witnesses to her enduring solitude. Each wave that crashed against the cliffs seemed to murmur her name, echoing the permanence of her punishment and the inevitability of her power. In this exile, Medusa's gaze, once innocent, then weaponized by divine decree, became the axis around which her world turned. Those who stumbled upon her domain, whether sailor or wanderer, felt the weight of her presence as a tangible force. The legend of the petrifying glance was not merely a story of horror. It was a story of survival, a way to encode the terrifying reality of encountering what is utterly other. In the liminal spaces of myth, where mortal comprehension falters, she became the ultimate boundary, a living monument to the consequences of divine wrath and human vulnerability alike. Yet exile is never solely punitive. There is, woven into its solitude, a profound reflection. Medusa's banishment allowed for the creation of a narrative that was not dictated by the gods alone, but by the landscape itself. The rocks, the waves, the storms, they became both witnesses and accomplices to her new form of existence. In myths of the ancient world, these natural spaces were imbued with moral and symbolic resonance. To dwell at the edges was to inhabit a world of extremes, fear and fascination, death and survival, beauty and terror entwined. Medusa, in her isolation, embodies the raw poetry of this geography, a being whose existence mirrors the stark, indifferent power of the elements around her. Art and literature of antiquity would later portray her in this exile as both monstrous and mesmerizing. Her serpents writhed against the wind like living flames, her eyes, turned to stone, mirrored not only the terror of others but the profundity of her own transformation. Every depiction carries with it an echo of solitude, a reminder that exile is both external and internal. The Greeks, through their poetry and sculpture, encoded an understanding of the human condition within her story. That suffering, when endured beyond measure, reshapes the self into something simultaneously fearsome and sovereign. Medusa's exile also illuminates a broader psychological truth that transcends myth. To be cast out is to confront the entirety of one's being without the comforting frameworks of society or community. Stripped of her previous identity as priestess, Medusa became a figure of reflection, a witness to her own endurance. Each storm that battered her, each tide that threatened to claim her, mirrored the storms within the human psyche. Anger, grief, and fear interlacing until they take a form both beautiful and horrifying. In this way, her story is not only about punishment but about the power of transformation under duress, a meditation on how adversity can carve out both danger and majesty. The environment of her exile, the stone, the cliffs, the open sea, becomes a mirror of her inner landscape. The harsh cliffs, jagged and unyielding, reflect the barriers imposed by divine judgment. The ceaseless tides, rising and falling without regard for her, echo the inexorable passage of time and the relentlessness of memory. And yet, in the unending expanse of sky and water, there is also freedom. Free from the immediate dominion of gods and men, she occupies a space that is entirely her own, even if it is wrought from isolation and fear. Exile, paradoxically, grants autonomy. She is feared, yes, but she is sovereign in her solitude. From this liminal vantage, Medusa becomes a figure of profound symbolism. She embodies the fragile boundary between mortality and the divine, the human and the monstrous. Her presence at the edges of the world is a reminder that fear is not simply born of physical threat, but of confrontation with the unknown, with forces beyond comprehension, with truths too vast to be held comfortably in human thought. In her silence, in the stillness of her domain, she articulates a cautionary truth. The consequences of crossing the sacred or transgressing boundaries are not ephemeral, they echo across time, carried by wind and stone and memory. And yet, even in isolation, there is a quiet dignity in Medusa's exile. She is a being who has been punished, transformed, and separated from the world she once knew, yet she endures. Her gaze, once weaponized by divine wrath, now defines the contours of her existence. In this way, the Gorgon is neither fully victim nor fully monster, but a complex symbol of resilience and power born of suffering. The Greeks, perhaps unwittingly, left her story as an exploration of the human capacity to survive, adapt, and command respect even in the harshest of circumstances. As the centuries pass, the legend of Medusa in her exile continues to resonate. From cliffside sculptures to the imaginations of storytellers, her solitary existence becomes a meditation on fear, punishment, and endurance. The stone cliffs and the endless sea, once her prison, transform into a stage upon which her story can unfold for all time. And in the undying memory of her gaze, we glimpse the paradox at the heart of myth, that suffering and solitude can produce not only terror but a transcendent, almost sacred presence. Exile among stone and sea is a lesson etched in marble and salt, a story that lingers on the wind. Medusa, alone yet commanding, reminds us that boundaries, divine, natural, or moral, are forces that shape the world as surely as they shape the soul. And in that solitary dominion, carved from punishment and survival, she becomes eternal, a sentinel on the edge of understanding, a witness to the relentless, haunting beauty of existence itself. Exile alone could not contain the transformation that had begun within Medusa. From the cliffs and salt-battered coves, a new presence emerged, one that was no longer merely human, yet not entirely divine. She had become a threshold, a living boundary where the natural and supernatural converged, and from this convergence, terror itself was born. In myth, terror is rarely a simple fright. It is the manifestation of forces beyond comprehension, distilled into a form the human mind can recognize. Medusa, once a mortal priestess, now carried the gaze of the gods within her, a reflection of divine wrath transmuted into living power. Her eyes, turned to instruments of petrification, became more than weapons. They were a language of warning, a message inscribed into the very fabric of the world. Transgression carries consequences that no mortal can endure lightly. The Greeks understood fear as both protective and instructive. Monsters, after all, are mirrors of human anxieties, the embodiment of what society most wishes to control or suppress. Medusa's transformation into terror was not an act of whimsy by the divine, but a deliberate reshaping of human understanding. By encountering her, the living were forced to confront their own fragility, their own capacity for violation, and the profound unknowability of the universe. She became a symbol not only of punishment but of the limits of human perception, a being whose existence demanded reverence and caution in equal measure. Her terror was not born of violence alone. It was cultivated in the silence of her exile, in the solitude of jagged stones and wind-swept waters, where the absence of witnesses allowed power to coagulate. Legends speak of travelers frozen to stone, of ships retreating from the cliffs at the sight of a solitary figure atop the craggy promontory. But these stories are not merely accounts of fear. They are reflections of the awe that arises when mortality brushes against something greater, stranger, and entirely indifferent to human understanding. This emergence of terror also carries a subtle tragedy. Medusa's new form isolated her not only from the world of men but from the realm of the divine. She became neither goddess nor human, a liminal being whose existence challenged the neat categories of myth and morality. In this space, the story shifts from simple punishment to profound reflection. How does the mind reckon with its own complicity, its own vulnerability, in the face of forces it cannot control? In Medusa's gaze, we see the crystallization of anxiety, the petrification of innocence into something formidable and unyielding. In art and literature, Medusa's terror is depicted with a strange duality, repulsion and fascination entwined. Her serpents writhe with life, eyes gleaming with an almost intelligent awareness, lips slightly parted as if to whisper secrets older than humanity itself. Sculptors and poets capture the tension between fear and desire, horror and admiration, as if to remind us that terror is never singular. It is layered, textured, and deeply human in its resonance. Through this lens, Medusa becomes more than a monster. She becomes a mirror in which civilizations glimpse their own fears and failings, a reflection of collective anxieties frozen in stone and story. But terror is never static. In Medusa it moves, breathes, and lingers. It transforms the landscape she inhabits. The cliffs become foreboding, the sea treacherous, the wind sharp with warning. Each storm, each wave, each cry of seabird carries her presence into the wider world, an invisible contagion that extends the reach of her power far beyond the narrow confines of her exile. In this way, the legend of Medusa serves not only as a cautionary tale but as a meditation on the nature of fear itself, pervasive, enduring, and impossible to ignore. Yet even as terror radiates from her, there is an underlying humanity to Medusa's existence. Her isolation is a crucible, and within it, she cultivates awareness, intelligence, and vigilance. She becomes the ultimate observer, attuned to the smallest tremor of movement, the faintest sound of life intruding upon her domain. In this heightened perception, there is both grace and tragedy. Grace in the mastery of her environment, tragedy in the absolute solitude that shapes her every thought and action. The terror she inspires is inseparable from the quiet dignity of her endurance, a testament to the transformative power of suffering and resilience. Psychologically, Medusa's terror can be understood as a profound reflection of human experience. We fear what we do not understand, what defies comprehension, what exposes our fragility. In her story, the Greeks encoded a timeless truth, that punishment, isolation, and transformation are inseparable, and that the lessons of myth extend beyond morality into the very structure of the human psyche. Medusa is terrifying because she embodies the consequences of divine law made flesh, the intersection of justice, vengeance, and the limits of mortal power. She is at once a mirror, a warning, and a testament to endurance in the face of forces that surpass reason. Even today, the terror of Medusa persists. She lingers in the shadows of art, in the rhythm of poetry, and in the quiet spaces where myth intersects memory. Her gaze, petrifying and eternal, serves as a reminder that fear is not a weakness but a form of knowledge, an understanding of boundaries, power, and consequence. In every depiction, from the earliest vase paintings to modern retellings, she retains her dual nature, monstrous and human, isolated and sovereign, horrifying and mesmerizing. As darkness falls across the cliffs and the waves pound against the shore, the figure of Medusa remains steadfast. Her presence is a quiet testament to the inevitability of transformation, the endurance of consequence, and the haunting persistence of memory. In terror there is meaning, in isolation there is power, and in the petrifying gaze of a woman exiled by gods, there exists a reflection of our own mortal fragility. Medusa's terror is not merely a story to frighten, but a story to instruct and endure. It reminds us that the boundaries between innocence and transgression, human and divine, life and legend, are often perilously thin. And in that space, carved from fear and resilience, she becomes eternal, an enduring sentinel on the edge of human understanding, where terror is not only a force but a revelation, and where the gaze of the exiled continues to hold the world in still, unforgettable suspense. Even the sacred walls of temples cannot contain the ripple of divine anger. Within Athena's sanctuaries, once places of refuge and contemplation, a singular act shattered the fragile equilibrium between mortals and gods. The sanctity of the stone, the solemnity of ritual, became the stage upon which innocence and transgression collided, leaving a scar that would echo through myth for centuries. The Greeks understood sanctuaries as more than buildings. They were thresholds between human and divine, spaces where the mortal mind could glimpse eternity. To violate such a space was not merely disrespect. It was to step into a realm where the consequences were immediate, inevitable, and inescapable. For Medusa, this violation was both personal and cosmic. She, a priestess bound to service and devotion, became the locus of punishment, her body and fate transformed into instruments of divine decree. The temple, with its columns and carvings of gods and heroes, witnessed the moment when human frailty met divine law. It was a place where every gesture, every glance, every whispered prayer carried weight, and where the gaze of the gods lingered with a cold, inescapable scrutiny. Medusa's violation, though human in origin, was magnified by this sacred stage, exposing the terrifying reality of life under the absolute authority of the divine. Here morality and power converged, shaping a story in which innocence could become sin, and devotion could become the seed of damnation. In the aftermath, exile and transformation followed swiftly. Medusa's punishment was not a private suffering but a public lesson, inscribed into the landscape of myth. The temple, once a haven, now became a memory of transgression, a reminder that sacred space demanded obedience and that the wrath of the gods could turn even the purest heart into a cautionary tale. Across the centuries, this narrative resonates as a reflection of humanity's fragile place in the universe. Caught between reverence and fear, devotion and hubris, desire and the inexorable gaze of judgment. Yet within this tale of destruction and divine wrath, there is also profound sorrow. Medusa's story is not merely one of terror but of violation, the loss of agency, the transformation of the self under forces beyond comprehension. The temple, symbolic of order and protection, becomes a mirror of vulnerability, a silent witness to the ways in which power and innocence collide. In this collision, the human experience of fear, grief, and isolation is rendered timeless, shaping the archetype of Medusa not merely as a monster but as a figure whose suffering speaks to the deepest anxieties of existence. The shattering of sanctuary also reframes the very nature of myth. It is not simply a narrative of punishment but a meditation on boundaries. Between the mortal and divine, the sacred and profane, the human and the monstrous. Medusa's fate is a testament to the fragility of order and the relentless consequences of stepping beyond the lines drawn by forces greater than ourselves. In her exile, the echo of broken stone and whispered prayers becomes eternal, resonating in the hearts of those who encounter her story, reminding us that sanctity is fragile and that the gaze of the divine is both protective and merciless. Even as time passes and temples crumble to dust, the memory of what was violated endures. Medusa's transformation into the monstrous, her exile into desolate landscapes, and her role as both warning and enigma are inseparable from the sacred spaces that shaped her destiny. The shattered sanctuary lives on not in stone alone but in the moral and psychological architecture of myth, where fear, awe, and reflection intertwine. It is a space in which humanity confronts its own limitations, the weight of transgression, and the haunting presence of forces it cannot command or fully understand. In every retelling, the temple is present, not merely as backdrop, but as a character in its own right. Its pillars witness the crime, its walls absorb the sorrow, and its memory anchors the narrative of Medusa in both place and time. The sacred is never neutral. It is charged with expectation, judgment, and consequence. And in this charged silence, Medusa's story unfolds as a meditation on power, vulnerability, and the indelible imprint of divine authority upon mortal life. The shattering of sanctuary leaves more than physical ruins. It leaves a moral and psychological echo, a space where fear and reverence coexist. Medusa's gaze, already transformed by exile, carries the weight of that violation forward into legend. Every petrified traveler, every whispered retelling, every sculpted visage becomes a testament to the enduring resonance of that singular act within Athena's halls. Through her, we are reminded that the sacred can never be taken lightly, and that transgression, once committed, casts shadows that stretch far beyond the walls that once contained it. As dusk falls across the ruins of ancient sanctuaries, the story of Medusa endures in the silence between pillars, in the spaces where light and shadow play upon worn stone. Her exile is not merely punishment, it is revelation. In the shattered sanctuaries of memory, we glimpse the fragile balance between devotion and defiance, innocence and consequence, and we recognize in her story the eternal tension between humanity and the divine. The temple, though silent and crumbling, continues to speak. Its echo is Medusa's legacy, a haunting reminder that even within the most sacred spaces, the gaze of the gods is unflinching, and that within every act of transgression lies the seed of myth, the birth of terror, and the enduring testament of a woman turned into legend. Banished from the sanctuaries of men and gods alike, Medusa stepped into a world that existed at the edge of civilization, where cliffs met the unrelenting sea and shadows clung to every stone. This was a realm neither fully mortal nor entirely divine, a liminal space where the boundaries of reality blurred, and where myth began to take root in the hearts of those who dared approach. Exile, in its harsh solitude, transformed her not only in body but in essence, shaping a presence that would haunt imagination for centuries. Isolation was both punishment and revelation. On barren cliffs and in hidden caves, the wind carried whispers of her story, each echo reinforcing her otherness. The landscape mirrored her new existence, wild, untamed, and filled with the quiet menace of the unknown. In the absence of human eyes, Medusa's gaze, now irrevocably altered, became both shield and weapon, a testament to the cruel intersection of divine retribution and human vulnerability. Liminal spaces hold power because they exist between worlds. Here, Medusa's transformation became visible not only in legend but in the psychology of fear itself. Travelers spoke of petrifying stares, but what they truly feared was the encounter with the threshold between life and myth, between the ordinary and the numinous. The cliffs and caves were not merely geography. They were the scaffolding of a story that would endure in memory, a physical manifestation of humanity's need to map its anxieties onto the landscape. Her exile also reframed the nature of punishment. No longer confined to stone halls or the gaze of priests, Medusa existed in a space where the natural and supernatural intertwined. Every echo of the waves, every shadow cast by jagged rocks, amplified the tension between mortal fear and divine decree. She became a sentinel of liminality, guarding the boundary between what is seen and what is imagined, between civilization and the wilderness of the psyche. Yet within this desolation, there was a quiet dignity. Medusa's life on the cliffs was not solely defined by terror. It was a meditation on survival, on adaptation, and on the endurance of self under forces beyond comprehension. The very act of existing in exile, of moving through spaces both sacred and forsaken, imbued her legend with a resonance that was both human and ineffably mythic. She became a mirror for the collective fears of those who cast her out, a reflection of the boundaries humanity imposes upon itself and upon those it deems transgressive. Over time, her presence shaped the imagination of generations. Poets, travelers, and painters would later capture fragments of her story, often emphasizing the horror, but occasionally glimpsing the profound sorrow beneath the monstrous visage. Liminal exile, as a concept, offered something more than punishment. It offered a place where humanity could explore its own fragility, where the intersection of innocence and retribution could be witnessed, and where the faintest glimmers of empathy might illuminate the darkest corners of fear. In the cliffside wind and the echoing caves, Medusa's gaze became a symbol of consequence, of the fragile line between devotion and violation, innocence and doom. It was not merely a weapon. It was a language of warning, a visual punctuation that spoke to the vulnerability of all who inhabit the threshold between safety and peril. Her exile transformed the contours of myth itself, ensuring that every retelling carried the imprint of isolation, the weight of judgment, and the haunting beauty of a woman caught between worlds. Even centuries later, travelers approaching desolate headlands would sense the presence of something beyond comprehension. The stories of Medusa persisted not only because of fear but because liminal exile creates resonance. It exists in the space where imagination and reality meet, where human curiosity and divine mystery converge, and where the story of one woman becomes a reflection of universal anxieties, loss, punishment, and the fragile balance of power. Exile, in this sense, was not the end but a transformation. The cliffs, the caves, the lonely heights where she roamed, all became extensions of her being, shaping the contours of her legend as much as her gaze shaped the petrified figures in myth. She was no longer merely Medusa of the temple. She was Medusa of the threshold, a figure suspended between memory and nightmare, between warning and myth, between humanity and the inscrutable gaze of the divine. In the wind-whipped solitude of liminal spaces, her story grew both terrifying and mournful, a meditation on the consequences of divine law enacted upon human flesh. Exile, punishment, and myth converged into a narrative that would endure far beyond the cliffs themselves, reverberating through art, literature, and the collective imagination. Medusa's gaze, sharpened by isolation and infused with sorrow, became a testament to the enduring power of liminality, the spaces that exist on the edge of worlds, where human fear meets the eternal, and where legends are forged in the silence of exile. As dusk falls over jagged cliffs and caves echo with the sound of crashing waves, the figure of Medusa remains a haunting presence, an enduring symbol of the fragile boundary between human and divine, punishment and understanding, fear and empathy. Liminal exile is more than a punishment. It is a prism through which the depths of myth and the human heart are refracted, revealing the timeless resonance of a woman turned legend, standing forever at the edge of worlds. In the desolate quiet of her exile, Medusa's eyes became the axis of her legend, a force both feared and misunderstood. They were no longer merely human or divine. They were a threshold where perception itself could betray the living, turning flesh into stone and wonder into terror. The gaze, forged in isolation and divine wrath, embodied a paradox. It was at once a weapon, a shield, and a mirror of humanity's deepest fears. The transformation of her eyes was not merely physical. Legends tell of serpents writhing atop her head, yet it was the intensity of her vision that captured the imagination. Those who claimed to witness it described more than horror. They felt an uncanny confrontation with the unknown, a sudden, inescapable reckoning with forces beyond mortal understanding. To look upon her was to glimpse a truth that civilization often concealed: the fragility of life and the invisible boundaries that separate safety from ruin. Throughout history, human cultures have projected their anxieties into the eyes of monsters. In Medusa, this projection became literal, a gaze that crystallized fear into form. The myths are filled with travelers, heroes, and poets who dared approach her, each encounter revealing as much about human curiosity as it did about the woman herself. Her stare was not just a defense. It was a language of consequence, a cautionary emblem that spoke to the consequences of hubris, violation, and the unseen wrath of forces older than human law. Yet, behind the petrifying power lay profound sorrow. The stories of her gaze often neglect the human cost, the loneliness, the longing, and the awareness of punishment unchosen but endured. In the reflection of stone and myth, Medusa's eyes became a mirror of empathy lost, an eternal witness to the cruelty of gods and men alike. Her gaze forces us to confront the same questions that ancient worshippers whispered beneath temple shadows. What is justice? What is innocence? And how often does the innocent bear the burden of divine or societal law? Artists and poets of later centuries would attempt to capture her stare, translating terror into brushstrokes, marble, and ink. Each depiction, however, fails to convey its full resonance. The true horror is not in the petrification itself, but in the intimacy of her judgment, the silent assertion of power that is impossible to flee. In this sense, the gaze becomes a profound psychological lens, revealing the eternal tension between observer and observed, predator and prey, human and myth. The Gorgon's gaze also intersects with broader human imagination. It embodies the transformative power of fear. How an encounter with the uncanny, however brief, can reshape memory, belief, and even behavior. By turning flesh to stone, Medusa does more than punish. She imprints her legend onto consciousness, a haunting reminder that some truths, when fully seen, are inescapable. This is why her story persists, why her eyes continue to fascinate, and why the term petrifying survives as both metaphor and warning across millennia. Symbolically, her vision challenges the perception of power. Medusa is at once victim and agent, punished by gods yet wielding authority over those who intrude upon her space. Her gaze is a paradoxical instrument of autonomy, asserting presence in a world that sought to erase her. It reminds us that even in exile, even in transformation imposed by divine law, there remains the capacity for agency, for influence, for shaping legend. In the shadowed cliffs and echoing caves of her exile, her stare was never idle. Wind and water became accomplices to the myth, carrying whispers of her presence to distant shores, instilling a subtle dread that transcended immediate sight. Travelers spoke of unseen eyes, of cliffs that seemed to watch, of reflections that froze the soul. The gaze transcended the corporeal. It became a cultural echo, a moral compass, and an eternal question. What does it mean to confront that which cannot be understood yet cannot be ignored? Even today, the Gorgon's gaze resonates beyond myth. In literature, art, and psychology, it symbolizes the confrontation with the forbidden, the dangerous, and the divine. It embodies the fragile threshold where knowledge becomes terror, and where observation itself carries consequence. In Medusa, the petrifying gaze reminds us that fear is not merely instinctive. It is historical, social, and profoundly human, shaped by stories passed down across centuries, carved into stone and whispered in the dark. As the sun sets over the cliffs where she wandered, the glint of her eyes, imagined, remembered, retold, remains a testament to the enduring power of myth. It is not the venom of serpents, nor the terror of mortality alone, that haunts us, but the gaze that demands reckoning. Medusa's stare is the quiet, unyielding echo of exile, transgression, and transformation, a visual poem of loss and warning, forever etched into the contours of human imagination. In the end, to meet her gaze is to confront a paradox as old as myth itself. Fear intertwined with empathy, punishment intertwined with power, and mortality confronted by the eternal. The Gorgon's eyes, like the cliffs and caves she inhabited, remain a liminal space where the human heart and the divine intersect, a place where legend crystallizes and where the shadows of the past continue to watch, waiting for those who dare to look too closely. In the quiet tension before dawn, when the world seemed suspended between myth and memory, a new figure approached the Gorgon's lair. Perseus, armed with gifts of the gods and the weight of mortal ambition, stepped into a realm where courage and recklessness intertwined. His journey was not simply one of conquest. It was a passage into the domain of consequences, where heroism and hubris were often indistinguishable. From the earliest retellings, the narrative of a man confronting Medusa illuminates the duality of human endeavor. To face a creature of such petrifying power was to court immortality and destruction in a single breath. Perseus' shield, polished to mirror perfection, was more than protection. It was a symbol of reflection, of confronting terror without surrendering to it. In its surface, the Gorgon's gaze became manageable, yet the psychological weight of the encounter lingered, reminding all who heard the story that even triumph is shadowed by risk. Heroes in myth are never purely virtuous, nor villains entirely corrupt. In approaching Medusa, Perseus embodies the eternal tension between action and consequence. His victory is not merely the slaying of a monster, it is the careful navigation of divine law, mortal fear, and moral ambiguity. Each step toward the Gorgon is a meditation on courage as a form of negotiation with fate, where one misstep could lead not to glory, but to oblivion. Hubris threads itself through the story like a subtle current. For all the gifts of Athena and Hermes, Perseus relies on cunning as much as valor. Mythology teaches that pride, when untempered, invites ruin. Yet in his measured approach, we glimpse the paradox of human audacity. Heroism demands confrontation, but it also demands restraint. In this interplay, the story becomes less a tale of brute force and more a meditation on perception, strategy, and the ethical dimensions of power. The narrative also reveals how societies project their ideals onto heroes. Perseus' journey serves as a moral and psychological mirror, reflecting cultural anxieties about violence, responsibility, and divine favor. He is both aspirational and cautionary, embodying the hope that humans might navigate a perilous world while acknowledging the unseen forces, divine, natural, and psychological, that shape destiny. The hero's triumph over Medusa becomes a lens through which civilizations explore their own understanding of justice, fear, and the limits of human endeavor. Yet, even in victory, the story retains the echo of tragedy. Medusa, silenced and beheaded, transforms from a living being into a symbolic instrument, a token of power, a warning, a relic of divine punishment. Perseus' success is inseparable from her loss, a reminder that myth often demands collateral, and that human ambition invariably intersects with suffering. This tension gives the narrative its haunting resonance, ensuring that the story lingers beyond the immediate act, casting shadows that ripple through literature, art, and collective memory. In art and literature, the encounter is depicted as both violent and beautiful. The gleam of the shield, the cascade of serpentine hair, the frozen stillness of the Gorgon's petrifying power. Each depiction amplifies the psychological and emotional dimensions of the story, allowing observers to feel both exhilaration and dread. The hero's gaze, the monster's gaze. They intersect in a moment of suspended time, a liminal space where mortality, divinity, and human desire converge. Through this myth, we also perceive an archetype that resonates across cultures. The individual who confronts the unknowable, armed with courage, intelligence, and a fragile understanding of consequences. Perseus' journey is not unique in its pattern. It is a reflection of humanity's enduring fascination with the tension between danger and mastery, fear and triumph. The story persists because it captures an essential truth, that in confronting what terrifies us, we also confront the dimensions of our own character. The Gorgon's lair, silent once more after the hero's departure, retains the residual weight of myth. It is a place of absence and memory, where the echoes of petrified fear linger in rock and shadow. Perseus departs, but the story does not conclude. It reverberates through time, teaching that heroism is inseparable from reflection, and that every act of courage carries within it the specter of moral and psychological reckoning. In the end, Heroes and Hubris reminds us that the most enduring conflicts are not merely battles of body or strength, but of perception, choice, and consequence. The encounter with Medusa is timeless because it mirrors the eternal human struggle, to act boldly in the face of unknown forces, to navigate the delicate line between bravery and folly, and to confront the consequences that even the most calculated actions cannot escape. As the sun dips below distant cliffs and the shadows lengthen, we are left with a quiet, unsettling knowledge that heroism is never isolated. It is entwined with myth, memory, and the enduring gaze of those we seek to overcome. And in that intertwined space, the legacy of both Medusa and Perseus endures, haunting, instructive, and profoundly human. The aftermath of Medusa's death is not merely a pause in violence, but a transformation that ripples through myth and memory. From her severed neck, the venomous gaze remained, crystallized in the uncanny stillness of stone. In that moment, blood became more than life. It became legend, a conduit through which divine power and mortal consequence intertwined. Medusa's head, preserved in the careful hands of Perseus, was no longer a creature but a symbol, a tool of both fear and protection. Athena's intervention ensured it was revered and feared, a potent emblem of justice and warning. Ancient storytellers understood that her gaze, though silenced in life, could continue to assert control, shaping events long after the mortal and monstrous forms had passed. The head was a weapon, but also a mirror, reflecting humanity's ambivalence toward power, beauty, and transgression. In every retelling, there is a subtle interrogation of morality. Medusa, once a priestess and a victim of divine wrath, now functions as both cautionary figure and apotropaic guardian. The petrifying gaze is a metaphor, not just of literal danger, but of the immobilizing weight of shame, fear, and societal judgment. Her story becomes a reflection of human psychology, how we turn trauma into myth, and how stories endure when they encapsulate truths too sharp for the living. The iconography that emerges, snakes writhing, a fixed, staring visage, invites contemplation of mortality and consequence. Artists of antiquity and beyond capture the tension between horror and reverence, reminding viewers that the monstrous is often inseparable from the human. In her transformation, Medusa challenges the observer. To what extent is she monster, and to what extent is she a mirror of society's deepest fears? Each image, whether carved in marble or painted on parchment, preserves the echo of her story and ensures it reverberates across generations. Perseus' act of severing her head also demonstrates the delicate balance between agency and inevitability. The hero does not simply destroy. He mediates between divine will and human courage. The blood that spills, the stone that forms, the head that is preserved, all are extensions of the mythic economy, where every act carries symbolic weight. It is a lesson in consequence, a meditation on the interplay of action and its lingering echoes. Through history, Medusa's visage became both protective and terrifying. Temples, shields, and amulets bore her likeness, invoking her petrifying power to ward off enemies. The very image that had once incited fear became a tool of human ingenuity, a talisman against the unknown. It is a paradox of myth. The same power that threatens can also safeguard, depending on the hands that wield it and the intentions that guide it. The story of Medusa's head also reflects enduring human fascination with transformation. Death does not conclude her presence. It transmutes her. The monstrous and the human coexist in her frozen gaze, teaching that myth does not simply entertain. It instructs, warns, and endures. Her petrifying stare becomes a meditation on the permanence of consequence, the haunting weight of memory, and the fragile line between victim and villain, punished and protector. Even in silence, her story speaks. The head rests in mythic memory as a testament to divine caprice, human courage, and the subtle terror of what lingers after death. It embodies the paradox that has always haunted Medusa: beauty and horror, innocence and punishment, mortality and enduring presence. Each retelling is an invocation, ensuring that her warning remains, long after the hero has departed and the lair has returned to shadow. And so, from blood to stone, Medusa transcends mortality, becoming more than a monster, more than a victim. She becomes a lens through which we examine fear, power, and the enduring consequences of both divine and human action. Her gaze, though fixed in legend, continues to petrify the imagination, challenging all who hear her story to reckon with the haunting intersection of justice, vengeance, and the fragile human condition. Medusa's story does not end with her death, nor with the petrified silence of her gaze. Instead, it drifts like a shadow across the centuries, growing heavier with each retelling, each brushstroke, each sculpted visage. Her myth became a prism, refracting the fears and values of countless generations, revealing not just the monstrous, but the human impulse to memorialize, to warn, and to wrest meaning from tragedy. In the temples of antiquity, in the frescoes and friezes of Greece and Rome, Medusa's image served as more than ornamentation. She was a guardian, a talisman against unseen dangers. Shields bore her staring face into battle, doors displayed her grimace to ward off intruders, and her image lingered in sanctuaries as both protector and admonition. What was once the punishment of a priestess became a weapon of human imagination, a conduit through which civilizations communicated their understanding of power, justice, and fear. As centuries passed, Medusa transcended the confines of her original myth. Artists and writers transformed her from a cautionary tale into a symbol of feminine rage, suffering, and resilience. Pain and punishment, once inflicted upon her by divine caprice, became metaphors for societal judgment, gendered violence, and the enduring strength of the marginalized. The snakes that crowned her head were no longer merely monstrous appendages. They became emblems of endurance, of transformation, and of the quiet, unsettling power that defies suppression. The Renaissance breathed new life into her legend, capturing her petrifying gaze with uncanny realism. Painters reveled in the tension between horror and beauty, framing her as both victim and avenger. Medusa's head became an artistic meditation on mortality and consequence, on the perilous intersection of beauty and violence, life and death. In these works, viewers are invited to linger, to confront the uneasy truth that monstrosity is never fully separable from humanity, and that punishment can, in time, be reshaped into power. Her myth also endured in literature, whispered in moral allegories and epic poems. Writers explored the ambiguity of her story: innocence corrupted, divine wrath inflicted, and the delicate boundary between victimhood and monstrosity. Each retelling layers additional meaning, reflecting not only the anxieties of its own age but also the timeless human fascination with the interplay of justice, vengeance, and the consequences of desire. Medusa's gaze became both mirror and warning, forcing each generation to reckon with its own fears and failings. Across cultures and epochs, the story of Medusa became a lens through which humans could explore the fragility of life and the permanence of consequence. Her image, preserved in stone and ink, in bronze and pigment, reminds us that myth is never static. It evolves, absorbs, and reflects the values, anxieties, and moral questions of those who inherit it. The woman turned monster, and then into legend, remains a haunting testament to the endurance of story, and the human need to extract meaning from terror. Even in modernity, her gaze endures, unflinching and immutable. She inspires both fear and reverence, a symbol of boundaries crossed and power wielded, of suffering endured and lessons unheeded. Medusa's legacy is a reminder that myth is never simply about monsters. It is about the human condition, about how stories survive because they speak to truths that transcend time. They remind us that memory, horror, and beauty are intertwined, and that the echoes of one life, one punishment, can reverberate across millennia, shaping thought, culture, and imagination. In the silent spaces of history, Medusa waits. Her legacy is not just the gaze that petrifies, but the reflection it casts back upon us. It is a call to witness, to reckon with the complexities of justice and the fragility of innocence. Her myth endures because it holds within it the weight of human experience, fear, retribution, resilience, and the strange, unsettling power of transformation. Through every era that adopted her story, Medusa became more than a warning. She became a touchstone. She reminds us that the past is not distant, that myth is not fiction, and that the consequences of cruelty, misjudgment, and divine whim continue to haunt the corridors of memory. Each gaze turned to her face, each retelling, is a meditation on the fragile line between victim and monster, punishment and power, mortality and myth. And so, in the quiet reflection of centuries, Medusa's weight presses onward. She is not a relic of forgotten fear, but a living testament to the human need to understand, to explain, and to endure. The monster we see is inseparable from the woman who lived before the gaze, before the snakes, before the stone. Her story is a bridge between eras, a mirror of culture, and a haunting echo of the truths that endure beyond death. Medusa's legacy is heavy, and it rests not in the myths themselves, but in the spaces they open within us, spaces of fear, empathy, reflection, and reverence. It is there, in those shadows, that her gaze remains alive, unyielding, and impossibly human. Long after the stone of Medusa's head was laid to rest in myth, her story refused to fade. It traveled through the whispers of poets, the strokes of painters, and the careful hands of sculptors, echoing across the centuries like a pulse beneath the quiet surface of history. Time, rather than erasing her, only sharpened her significance, transforming her from a tale of punishment into a mirror of human complexity, a reflection of both fear and fascination. In the Renaissance, artists resurrected Medusa with meticulous care, capturing the tension between horror and beauty in every sinew, every lock of serpentine hair. Her visage became a study of human psychology, a frozen meditation on rage, vulnerability, and retribution. Viewers could not help but confront themselves in her gaze. Her petrifying stare compelling introspection as much as terror. The myth was no longer merely cautionary. It was a lens through which society examined the nature of consequence, desire, and power. As the centuries unfolded, Medusa's image seeped into literature, philosophy, and cultural imagination. She became a symbol of the human struggle to reconcile innocence with punishment, beauty with violence. In the hands of writers, she spoke to the anxieties of each era, a warning of unchecked ambition in one century, a testament to feminine rage in another. The tale of the woman-turned-monster transcended the particulars of Greek mythology, becoming an allegory for universal human truths, the fragile boundary between victim and oppressor, the eternal tension between mortality and myth. Even in modern times, Medusa's legacy thrives in unexpected ways. Her image appears in psychology as a metaphor for trauma, in art as an emblem of resilience, and in popular culture as a figure of empowerment. The story that once taught fear now teaches reflection, showing us how narratives evolve, bending with the tides of social understanding. The snake-haired woman whose gaze turned men to stone is no longer confined to the shadows of myth. She walks among us in paintings, films, literature, and even the quiet musings of those who study human nature. Each retelling of her story reshapes her, layering new meaning atop old. In feminist interpretations, she becomes a symbol of strength and autonomy, a woman punished for what others sought to control, yet refusing to vanish from memory. In psychoanalytic readings, she embodies the haunting power of the subconscious, the terrifying yet instructive forces that dwell within the human mind. Across disciplines, across centuries, Medusa's narrative demonstrates the enduring capacity of myth to carry the weight of human emotion and intellect, to serve as both mirror and lesson. Her influence is subtle yet relentless. In the shadowed halls of art museums, her face confronts the observer. In literature, she whispers from the margins of narrative. In psychology, she teaches the delicate language of trauma, warning that the past, when ignored, can petrify the present. The echoes of Medusa reverberate because they are not merely stories. They are instruments of human reflection, probing the spaces where fear, memory, and morality converge. Yet Medusa's echo is not solely about observation. It is about participation. Each encounter with her story asks something of us: to see the consequences of cruelty, to recognize injustice, and to ponder the boundaries of compassion. Her myth persists because it resonates with truths that are unchanging, truths about how societies judge, how individuals endure, and how humanity wrestles with the duality of destruction and protection, of wrath and mercy. Even now, as we move through a world far removed from the marble temples of Athens, Medusa speaks. Her gaze is not simply petrifying. It is a call to witness, to acknowledge the continuity of human experience across time. She reminds us that myth is never static, that stories evolve as we do, and that ancient fears can illuminate modern challenges. In every interpretation, every brushstroke, every scholarly reflection, Medusa lives, not as a relic, but as a guide through the complex landscape of morality, power, and identity. Ultimately, the echoes of Medusa teach that legends endure not because they entertain, but because they illuminate. They reveal the frailty and resilience of humanity, the perils of transgression, and the enduring power of consequence. Her story persists because it matters, because it continues to provoke thought, reflection, and even awe. In tracing her path from priestess to monster, from cautionary tale to cultural icon, we glimpse the extraordinary persistence of narrative itself, and the way stories like echoes traverse the centuries unbroken yet ever-changing. And so, Medusa remains. Her legacy reverberates through the corridors of art, literature, and human consciousness, reminding us that myth is more than memory. It is the living pulse of culture, the persistent echo of ancient truths. In every retelling, in every gaze turned to her face, the woman who became a warning continues to speak, challenging us to see, to reflect, and to remember. In the silent aftermath of legend, Medusa's story lingers like a shadow at the edge of memory. Time has softened the sharp edges of fear, yet her image, snakes coiled, eyes frozen in petrifying command, continues to demand attention. The gaze that once turned flesh to stone now turns thought inward, compelling reflection on the fragile line between humanity and myth. The temples that once echoed with the footsteps of priests and the whispers of devotees have crumbled to dust, yet the essence of Medusa endures. She is no longer merely a figure of punishment, nor solely a cautionary tale of divine wrath. She has become a mirror, reflecting the complexities of human morality, the collision of innocence and transgression, the perils of envy, the hidden power of rage, and the consequences of cruelty left unchecked. In her, the divine and the mortal intertwine, revealing that stories are not confined to their time. They migrate, transform, and take root in the collective imagination. Through centuries, Medusa's visage has been inscribed onto shields, painted upon canvases, carved into marble, and written into texts. Each iteration deepens her meaning, revealing something new about the cultures that remember her. To the ancient Greeks, she was a warning. To the Renaissance, a study of terror and beauty. To modern minds, a symbol of resilience and the enduring struggle for agency. Her myth evolves because human nature evolves, and with it the lessons we draw from the stories we tell. The last gaze of Medusa is not meant to frighten, it is meant to awaken. It asks us to confront our own reflections in the still waters of history. It reminds us that fear can be a teacher, that punishment can be both unjust and illuminating, and that myth carries truths that transcend time and place. In the quiet spaces between legend and memory, her story becomes something more profound than horror. It becomes a meditation on consequence, empathy, and the intricate web of human experience. In every retelling, in every cautious glance toward her face, Medusa speaks across the centuries. She reminds us that stories, though ancient, are never dormant. They are living echoes, shaping perception, morality, and imagination. And in this persistent echo lies the power of myth itself, to endure, to instruct, and to haunt. As we step away from the shadow of her narrative, we carry with us the weight of what she represents. The enduring tension between beauty and terror, innocence and transgression, mortality and memory. The snakes that curl about her head are no longer merely instruments of horror. They are symbols of vigilance, of resilience, of lessons etched into the very fabric of human consciousness. And so Medusa's gaze, once deadly, becomes timeless. It does not turn flesh to stone in the modern world, yet it freezes our attention, commanding recognition of the truths that lurk within the depths of myth and history. In the final analysis, the woman-turned warning is not gone. She lives within the stories we carry forward, in the art we create, and in the questions we ask about justice, power, and the fragile complexity of being human. Her legacy is complete not in the acts that condemned her, but in the reflection she inspires. Medusa endures because she teaches us to see the hidden consequences of our actions, the weight of judgment, and the fragile interplay of humanity and divinity. She reminds us that myths are not merely stories of the past. They are mirrors, windows, and warnings, and that the last gaze is ours to meet, to understand, and ultimately to remember. In the stillness after legend, when the echoes fade and the world moves on, the gaze remains. It is a quiet, haunting reminder that history, myth, and memory are never separate. They are entwined like the serpents that crown her head, forever entwined in the eternal dance of story and meaning.